Share the mic with.
Good morning,
Share the mic.
everyone.
Morning.
So nice. My name's Camille Charles. I'm professor of sociology, Africana Studies, and education. I'm also director of the Center for Africana Studies and chair of the Department of Africana Studies here at the University of Pennsylvania. I'd like to welcome and thank all of you for coming to our one-day symposium, The Politics of Black Women's Hair. And before we begin, I'd also like to ask that you keep in mind that our event is being webcast live online, so we ask that you please silence your cell phones and PDAs, and I want to thank you for that. It's my great pleasure to open this day-long symposium to discuss the political, social, and business aspects surrounding Black women's hair. I'm pleased to present our academic panelists for today's first panel, and know that their full bios can be read in our program booklet. And the one other thing I'd like to do before we get started is to thank a few people without whom we wouldn't have gotten all of this together and made it here today. I'd like to thank the staff in the Center for Africana Studies, Tia Campbell, Michelle Houston, Gail Garrison, and Carol Davis, who took care of all of the logistics and dealt with the faculty here who have crazy schedules, and all of our panelists, and made sure that everything ran smoothly. I'd also, thank you. I'd also like to thank Professor Anthea Butler, who's Associate Professor of Religious Studies and Africana Studies, who came to me with this idea and really did make sure that everything got pulled together and that we got here today. Our first panelist is Dr. Noliwe Rooks. She's an associate professor in Africana Studies and feminist gender sexuality studies at Cornell University. She's an award-winning author and editor of several books, including Hair Raising, Beauty, Culture, and African American Women, and Paris Connections, African American Artists in Paris, 1920 to 1975. Dr. Tiffany M. Gill is an associate professor in the Department of Black American Studies and the Department of History at the University of Delaware. Dr. Gill is the author of Beauty Shop Politics, African American Women's Activism in the Beauty Industry, which was awarded the 2010 Letitia Woods Brown Memorial Book Prize by the Association of Black Women Historians. And Dr. Tanisha Ford is an assistant professor of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Dr. Ford is an award-winning writer, intellectual teacher, and activist. She's currently writing a book titled Liberated Threads, Black Women and the Politics of Adornment. And finally, I'm honored to present our moderator for this panel, Dr. Melissa Harris Perry, host of MSNBC's The Melissa Harris Perry Show, and professor of political science at Tulane University, and founding director of the Anna Julia Cooper Project on Gender, Race, and Politics in the South. And by the way, Professor Harris Perry and the Center are co-sponsors for this event, so I'd like to thank you for that as well. Dr. Harris Perry is the author of the well-received book Sister Citizen, Shame, Stereotypes, and Black Women in America, and the award-winning Barbershops, Bibles, and BET, Everyday Talk and Black Political Thought. Before I turn the panel over to Dr. Harris Perry, on behalf of the Center for Africana Studies, again, I would like to thank my friend and colleague, Dr. Anthea Butler, for her vision and conceptualizing the idea for today's symposium. Please join me in welcoming all of our panelists and our moderator. Yes.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So I feel like I am in some sort of, I don't know, maybe I did something right at some point in my life, because I have had an opportunity in the past week to speak at Spelman and then to be here. And I just never find myself in rooms that look like this. And so to twice in the course of a week find myself in rooms that look like this is pretty wonderful. So I just first want to acknowledge that, and that it's really quite lovely to be in that circumstance. And yet I know that being in a room that looks like this doesn't even begin to come close to the idea that we are all in agreement about even the most basic questions of politics, society, economics, any of that. And so part of what's exciting here is that we can take this space and use it for conversation. So I'm just going to set up a couple of things, and then I'm mostly here to moderate and try to put a few issues on the table that I think will become relevant over the course of the day and have an opportunity to start to engage not just here on the panel, but also with folks in the audience who I just, for some reason, believe you all might have some opinions about these things. I want to just start with where I typically start in undergraduate classes on race, whether they are political science courses or feminist politics courses. And it's always with that initial need to talk to 18-year-olds about the fact that race is a social construction. Right? And this has been particularly interesting for me now that I am teaching in the Deep South, although they're all from New Jersey. It's like there's some kind of weird exodus from New Jersey to the South. So they're not necessarily Southerners, but kids who decide even to go to college in the Deep South. As soon as we do the race as a social construction, it's always difficult for students to get past their assertion that race is a biological reality. And to the extent that that I can push them a little bit on the idea that race is historically contingent, that it is based on a set of laws and social practices, self-understandings, and that one body can take on a different racial identity in the same day if that body flies to another part of the world, right? And therefore you know that it can't be genetic if it takes on a new meaning in a different place on the same day, or that the same kinds of bodies, the same kinds of characteristics can take on different meanings across time. So certainly in New Orleans, again, that's a place where we're still constructing race all the time. I live in the 7th Ward, where there's a whole lot of people who understand themselves as Creole. And that is a designation that doesn't make a lot of sense in Philadelphia, for example, but is a critically important space in Louisiana. I say all of that to say, as much as I assert regularly the critical importance of understanding the social construction of race, when it's time to do your hair, it feels like race is a biological reality. It is the constant reifying, returning moment, I think in ways that is perhaps even more powerful than complexion or nose shape or, behind or thighs or any of the other things that we start to think about as constructed around Black women's physical identities. That when it's time to either make a choice about whether you're going to perm your little girl's hair or braid it, whether or not you're going to wear the extensions or just your own hair, whether or not you've decided that you love your hair, you don't, all of that feels like race is a biological reality, like it is not socially constructed, like it's not just given meaning, but instead as though race were real and the realness of it is sprouting from our heads. And so part of what I want to do is have this panel to do some of the deconstruction of the idea that our hair is exclusively some sort of biological reality or genetic issue that has to be dealt with, that has to be addressed, and instead to try to think about the cultural, economic, social, and political meanings. Okay, so I'm going to start with my dear friend and former colleague, Noliwe Rooks, whose book I think is probably one of the first ones that I read in terms of fundamentally engaging the question of African American women's hair. And so for that, I am incredibly grateful for your work. And we are contemporaries, so I don't know how it's possible that you wrote a book that somehow changed my whole life, but it did, so there you go. Start by giving me a sense of what first motivated your initial work on it and what continues to motivate your work on Black women's hair.
Thank you. That's so gracious. So I have a cold, so I'm having my Demi Moore moment, right? I don't think that I'm catching because I've been on antibiotics for a few days. So this was my students yesterday, kind of like, look at this guy. Where I started, it's funny. This morning, we were running in here at the very last minute because, in part, we had a very deep, intellectually stimulating conversation about The Life is But a Dream, Beyonce's video, which of course, Beyonce is nothing if not all about her hair. This segued from Beyonce somehow into the encyclopedic knowledge here on this panel about Black women on reality TV shows, right? Which went through Basketball Wives to Love and Hip Hop to, did we do the Sisterhood? I don't think we got to the Sisterhood, but we could have.
Yeah, 30 more minutes. Yeah.
And the thing that was really interesting to me as I was thinking about coming here was all of this conversation. We weren't talking about hair in these women, right? We were talking about, what we think about this is a Beyonce stan here, but she has a critique, and, all what it means for Black women to a stalker fan for Beyonce, what it means for these kinds of images to be circulating. But it's really true that hair is actually deeply important to all those representations, I think, in ways that we don't often talk about. So while looking around this room, for example, we could very easily say, look how hair can be any and everything. It can do any and everything. Y'all have fabulous hairstyles, and much like Melissa, it is always gratifying for me when I am in spaces like this. I went to Spelman, right? So not so much natural hair when I was at Spelman. Now there is. It's still wonderful to see all of this, and yet when we think about Black women's bodies and our constructions in the public sphere, specifically on those reality TV shows that, for better or worse, are some of the highest rated on network television amongst Black women from 18 to 39, right? Taken as a whole, more than Olivia Pope and Scandal. We are into these reality shows, and yet you do not, or you do see a narrative about hair. It's not self-conscious. It's not politicized. It's not critiqued. But it's very much present. So as Black women are aggressively entering this kind of public space, this mediated public space, for all of the fabulous intellectual work that many of us do in our spaces, there's a narrative about our bodies that enter as well. And that's not me saying that I think everybody's hair needs to look like y'all's hair on reality TV. I do think, though, that the fact that there's so few options around hairstyles means something, right? And I'm still grappling with exactly what. But very specifically and very quick, because I went on a whole, like, what we were talking about, eating for breakfast thing. When I got started, I actually had to convince my committee that hair was a topic that I should be allowed to write about, right? So when you write a dissertation, I'm sure many of you know, you actually have to get buy-in, sign off, and people have to say this is a valid thing to write about. I was in American Studies, which is interdisciplinary, and I was literally, one day, I kept throwing out topics. I didn't remember what they were. Like, I want to write about Toni Morrison. I want to write about, and then people were like, yes, because no one's ever written about Toni Morrison before. That's what you need to do. And I was walking by a bus stop, and at the time I had locks, and I had just started to lock. And for those of you who either have gone through that process or seen it, there's a period where it's just not cute. There's nothing, you can't make it cute. You can, put little bandanas on it. You can, wrap it up, but it's just not cute. And I was walking by a bus stop, and these two older Black women were sitting there, and they were like, "Child, is it that bad? You need a comb." I swear to you. And in that moment, honestly, it just sort of hit me. I was like, you know what? Like, because I can unpack that. I can unpack that generationally. I can unpack that religiously. I can do a gender read on what they were looking at. And as I always tell people, I'm kind of color struck because I spent part of my growing up years in the South. And growing up in the South as a dark-skinned Black woman, I see and hear and read color almost unconsciously, right? So I was like, I can do a color struck. So I went around tried to convince my professors there's a dissertation to be written if I start at the earliest moments where hair actually, not where it became a thing for Black women, but where styling your hair, I could trace the social significance of what hair straightening could mean, right? There was enough there archivally. There was enough there in literature, biographies, that I could tell a story. They all said no. They are like, there's nothing there that's been done. No one wants to hear about that, and everybody's got hair. What's the big deal? And so I finally ended up talking to a historian, the last person I could talk to, and I was going to have to move on, named Linda Kerber, who's a woman's historian. She's also Jewish and has what she describes as a Jufro. And I was telling her, and before I could even get it fully out my mouth, she was going, yep, because she used to go to Harlem. She's from New York. She used to go to Harlem to get her hair done. And so she not only understood beauty parlors as a black female space in a way, but she understood the significance of hair, of her texture in her community and her culture and what that meant. And so she was able to convince my committee that there was a story to be told. And so that's where it came from.
So you said a couple of things there that I was writing down as you were saying them, because my favorite moment on Scandal, I do stand for Beyonce, but I also have a bit of a Kerry Washington problem. But my favorite moment on Scandal is the moment when she's dating the African-American senator, and he's explaining to her that he loves her, and he's like, I love you. And he says, I've seen you press your hair.
Right.
And I mean, one, because you realize at that moment that if Shonda Rhimes isn't writing that, then there's that sentence is never said on television, right? That's a kind of insider knowledge moment, and you also know that there's a whole group of people for whom that went, right? And that's right, and that's kind of enjoyable just to know that you're in on this sort of inside discursive. Mm-hmm. But it also, unfortunately, has ruined the series for me now, because I now can never love Fitzgerald Grant, right? The president, because there isn't like I think, oh, Olivia, you really do love this man, right? You must love him because he's seen you press your hair, right? And therefore you all have an intimacy and a friendship that you need to focus on. So anyway. But as you were talking about the vocabulary, the emotion, and then even sort of finally connecting with an advisor who starts to get it, Tiffany, I want to come to you on that, because that's part of why hair becomes sort of a central entrepreneurial space for black women, because in fact there is a vocabulary, there is a set of needs, there's all sorts of again what feel like biological imperatives around it that allow it to be an economically beneficial space.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and that sort of connects to how I came to my work on African American women and hair, and particularly looking at the site of a beauty shop and a beauty salon. These questions about intimacy and the ways in which, for African American women who, for the early part of the 20th century, or sort of at the dawn of the new century, the new last century, really did not have anyone who cared for them and their beauty needs. So we have women like Madam C.J. Walker and Annie Malone, who come on the scene at this moment where African American women in particular are struggling to figure out what it means to be a modern woman, what it means to sort of come into your own. They're one generation removed from slavery. They are migrating. They are partaking of this new life, this new urban life. And the way that they wanted to express that was in their deportment. And a lot of that had to do with their hair. So we have Madam Walker, we have Madam Malone, who are not only just providing products for African American women to sort of transform their look. And I think it's important to note that they never saw themselves as trying to make black women white. And that was something that was really important for me in my scholarship, that we move away from these very kind of simplistic notions that styling one's hair in a particular way is a way of denoting that someone is trying to be white or someone is rejecting blackness. These women saw the entrepreneurial opportunities of the beauty industry as a way to celebrate black women. And yes, they did it through things like straightening combs, although Madam Walker would never use the word straightening in any of her ads while she was alive, because she knew that association with whiteness. So what they did is they provided this rich entrepreneurial space. They provided these intimate ways for black women to care for themselves, to care for others, and to make a lot of money in the process. So we have Madam Walker sort of becoming this entrepreneurial giant, but what's important is not only her own economic success, but that she saw as an integral part of her role as providing avenues for African American women, particularly in the beginning of the 20th century, to escape the drudgery of domestic labor. Walker herself was a laundress, and so she connected this idea, this desire to feel modern, this desire to feel beautiful, with actual economic opportunity. And so we have, the way I came to this research is looking at the actual industry, right? It was an easier battle for me when it was time for me to write my dissertation because of people like Noliwe Rooks, who had sort of paved the way that these questions about beauty and hair for African American women were not seen as so taboo, not seen as so frivolous. And so part of what I try to do in my work is connect what seems to be very frivolous, to connect these ideas about beauty and adornment, and to show that they actually do meet not just a kind of psychological need for Black women, but also a political need. So we see beauty shops, for example, as being in the forefront of Black women's political engagement. And so I came to questions and issues of hair through my desire to look for political engagement. I had no idea that that would land me in my research in beauty shops. But really, if any of us have ever been in a beauty shop, it seems like a very logical place because it is a space where Black women are gathering almost exclusively. It is a space where we're talking about the things that are most important to us. And no matter what is happening in that space, whether it's hair straightening, whether it's, all sorts of things that are going on, locking, twisting, we can talk about natural hair salons hopefully later on. It is a space where we're having our intimate needs met. So why not just our hair needs being met, but also our sort of political and social needs being met as well? So I think it's important in this conversation to keep the entrepreneurial side, to think not just of the hair on our head, but also the spaces in which we are engaged in not just conversations about hair, but conversations about the things that are most important to us.
So, Tiffany, I want to just one follow-up before I move on to Tanisha on that. As you talk about as you talk about space and the ways in which the beauty salons are operating as space, it seems to me that one of the things that has declined over time, and I'm also going to come to you on this on the question of social movements, one of the things that's declined over time in African American political life has been the diasporic nature, the sense of being international cosmopolitan citizens engaged in world struggle. And I just need to ask whether or not you think the international component to indigenous is the best word, Negroes having their hair done by African immigrants, by Caribbean immigrants, by Dominicans, by Black women defined as Blackness from around the world might operate as a way to start moving us towards a more diasporic worldview.
Almost as if, sort of one nation under the hood of the beauty shop cap or something like that, like one nation under an afro. I mean, I do think it's very interesting to think about the ways in which Blackness get constructed through hair. And I think this gets back to your earlier point, that hair becomes this marker of racial difference. And historically, it was part of what was used to sort of discriminate against African Americans. So you're not only being vilified for your dark skin, but you're also vilified for your woolly hair. In the converse, it can also sort of be a unification factor. It also can be a way in which African Americans and Black people of the diaspora can sort of come together in these conversations. I think the internet has played a really sort of crucial role, particularly with natural hair care, in that women who are often in spaces where there aren't many people of the diaspora, people living in parts of Europe and other places, can now go online and connect with an actual online hair community of women from all across the globe, African-descended women from all across the globe that are having conversations about their hair, talking about the struggles, talking about their triumphs. And so I do think there is a potential for these products, for this community that's happening not just in beauty shops locally, but also the kind of ways in which online communities are even expanding our notion of community across the globe through these different spaces. But I think there's also potential harm as well, because as we're talking about this kind of globalization, some of the people who are paying attention to the kind of global dynamics of Black beauty culture are multinational corporations like L'Oreal. I mean, they've been paying attention for a long time, right? That they're also capitalizing on this kind of globalized Black beauty culture. And so there are ways in which beauty culture as a global phenomenon can be both empowering as well as ways in which people can sort of co-opt into these communities.
Thank you. So Tanisha, I want to start there, both with the sense of where we are today and the possibilities of internationalism within our politics, but also if you could start to give us a little sense of how, I love this idea that social movements are connected to our hair.
Yeah, so for me, as an intellectual who kind of, my earliest kind of inclinations to study Black women's hair and adornment politics really happened at this moment where I decided to have my big chop. right, to cut my hair off and go natural in graduate school. And it was around this time that I was rediscovering the music of Nina Simone and, you know, studying Black women who were involved in the movement. And it made me think back to my childhood, these moments in which I think of my mother, who was a self-proclaimed Black feminist, right, who would wear her hair natural and would dress me in Black is Beautiful t-shirts in the 80s and, you know, really teach me this history about her life on college campuses and the African-inspired clothing she would wear. And my father, who was a Black music enthusiast, right? So every Saturday involved me sitting on his lap and having these conversations about music and analyzing album covers and thinking about soul and jazz. And so all these questions are going through my head as I'm entering in graduate school. And really, my research is an outgrowth of trying to understand my parents and their generation, right?
That's true. Every academic is writing about
Yeah.
themselves. Some people are just more honest about it. Yeah.
Exactly, you know, and so it's really about trying to understand this civil rights, Black Power movement era in which my parents came of age. And so when I initially approached the work, I had this kind of romanticized notion about the movement, this era where Black people were unified and there was a sense of solidarity, and a lot of this happened around conversations about adornment, right? That our afro was a way that we could unite, you know, collectively under the afro, collectively under the dashiki, right? So as I began doing this work and digging deeper, I realized, though, that even in this era, there was no universally understood idea about topics like natural hair or what it meant to be natural, right? We see these early ads in the 1950s and in the early 1960s where Black women who have chemically processed hair are making claims to natural, right? That this is a natural type of beauty. We too can have this beauty. And even within Black nationalist communities, people are having debates where their Black nationalist women have to wear their hair naturally, or can we claim hair straightening is also a legacy of pre-colonial Africa as well. And so this began to enrich my ideas about how to study this moment. And that really, I think oftentimes today we have these conversations and we hold up the Black Power era as this moment of unity and solidarity in ways that kind of makes our engagement with conversations about natural hair and body politics seem like, okay, well, there was this era where Black people had it figured out, you know, and that our hair was a symbol that we had. But really what my work has revealed for me is that these were contested conversations. Even when I look at the civil rights movement, I've interviewed various women who were involved with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And these women told me stories like, yes, we did go natural, oftentimes for practical reasons, right? We didn't have access to beauty salons. We didn't know where to get our hair done locally. We didn't have the money to do it. So it became a sense of pride and community in which they could rally around, but that there was this pain at first, that we weren't upholding these ideas of respectability through our hair. But they use it and they said, well, but the movement is important. And so therefore we have to learn to adjust to this natural hair. So that was, for me, was a powerful moment where I felt like, wow, this didn't just happen. It wasn't like one day Black women woke up and said, yes, it's all about the short crop natural, right? That there was a political process that they were engaged in. And similarly, in the Black Power movement years, there were all these conversations about, do you wear the Afro wig? Do you not wear the Afro wig, right? Can your hair kink up enough to make the perfectly rounded Afro? Can it not? And so there were all these debates about Black authenticity as it related to hair and adornment. And so I see some of those similar conversations playing out beyond the boundaries of the United States as well. There's always this kind of cross-cultural conversation between Black women who are engaged in beauty politics and hair in the United States, but also other parts of the African diaspora. For example, I came across research in which women in Trinidad are going to the US to learn how to style hair and then coming back to Trinidad and then migrating to places like the UK where they're bringing these hair practices. So there's very much this politics around Black women's hair that has these global dimensions. movements in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s as well. And so I think some of the conversations we're seeing today via YouTube take up a lot of these same issues about, globalization, about natural hair politics, about what it means for Black people across the Atlantic. And so I agree with Tiffany that the internet becomes this interesting space that is mediated, but also a space in which, similar things, like if we're not saying having the conversations about the hot comb, who's gonna have them, right? So YouTube becomes a space where we can have these conversations in the 21st century. But I do see all these things as linked, and that it is related to this history of contestation, a history of pleasure and politics and where these things meet. And so hopefully over the course of the day, these are things that we can see play out both in this panel, but also in the hearing from the hair care professionals, how they see this happening on the ground level where they work every day.
Okay, so now what since we've all had sort of a moment, now what I want to do is just offer a couple of questions, and then feel free to jump in however you like. So the first is, I think a lot of times we frame this around a racial question, and particularly sort of Black women making choices vis-a-vis white power structure, or vis-a-vis white supremacy. But let me ask you about patriarchy within Black communities and the question of hair and hair choices for women. Not so much in the marketplace of employment and the constraints around that, but the marketplace of romantic heteronormative love and what that's meant, the sorts of rules and questions that may be associated with African American men and women. Now, we can talk about other aspects, but I want to start with the heteronormative patriarchy first.
Yeah, I think this issue about the choices that women make and how to style their hair are often very much informed about what women may think is attractive, what women will think might be attractive to men. And in the film Good Hair, which I have lots of problems with for a host of reasons, to me the most—
We could just do a whole panel.
Yes, we could. But to me, one of the more troubling aspects of that already troubling film are the discussions that are happening in barbershops around the ways in which Black men are talking about Black women's hair, and that it became this very much kind of sexualized conversation about what a woman will allow or won't allow a man to do with her hair. And so there's this way in which that entire film and a lot of these discussions, I think, unfortunately, are often pitched where we're sort of tunnel visioned into thinking about what this means for men, what this means for attractiveness. I make up words all the time. Attractability is not a word.
It's a good word.
You'll work, but it should be, right? But there's a way in which I think that conversation becomes both, it's a real conversation, but it's also a very limiting and narrow one. Because I think that the ways in which Black women have talked about hair and sort of the choices that they've made include issues about attractiveness, but are sort of much deeper and much more personal. And I honestly think have a lot more to do with the kind of internal dynamics that Black women have among ourselves than conversations that either men are having about Black women's hair or that even white people are having about Black people's hair. That I think, and to go back to Noliwe's early example, the example of these older Black women sort of vilifying hair, the most commentary I get about hair comes from other Black women about the kinds of choices that I make. I think for many men, as well as for many whites, there's so much kind of this confusion or, there is, like, people just don't understand Black people's hair. And so I think that sometimes, both with men or with whites, they don't know, is she wearing a weave? Is, what's going on? Mm-hmm. And so I think that sometimes, I think this conversation about patriarchy and sort of the male gaze on women's bodies is important. But I think in terms of the kind of social angst over Black women's hair often has a lot to do with how we're sort of self-policing those boundaries among ourselves. So I'll stop with that, but hear what other folks have to say about it.
But I fully and totally, agree with everything that you said, but I'm not sure. So there's this sort of idea about women's self-love and self-care that when women are their best self, we'll have an Oprah moment, right? So when women are sort of their best self, the light just kind of shines through, and that's when the universe opens the path for you. I told you I was from California. So the universe sort of opens the path for you and things come in, but you have to first have this self-love, right? And I feel like this moment, and to some extent in the 60s and 70s, was about a sort of Black political love in a way. But it now really is about Black women saying, I want to touch my hair. I want to do things with it I haven't done before, or it's convenient, or I just want options, right? There's all kinds of reasons for it, but it's about choices and stuff. But I'm not sure that Black men are always ready for that, right? And so for heterosexual Black women who are single and interested in attracting, and in having a range of options around Black male companionship, that whole idea of just this, just be yourself, and if he doesn't like you with your hair like that, he wasn't for you, and you're kind of like, yes, that is exactly true. And then you got a lot of people who are all about themselves because, we are so looksist, women and men. Right? We make quick decisions about people's characters and suitability and likability, based on all this surface stuff. So I think it's true that, we have to, in this moment where we're changing, and I have a 21-year-old son who somehow, I don't know, as much as we talk about hair, as much as he's seen me do my hair, I had locks until he was 18, 19. Like, he'd never seen me with anything but natural hair. And who didn't understand why my hair, one day he just said to me, so when you take out your locks, which is the first horrifying thing, right? When you take out your locks, are you gonna look like Beyonce? Not are you gonna have hair like Beyonce, which I think is what in fact he meant. However, what he said was, are you gonna look like Beyonce? And I realize even my son, who we have raised to be gender sensitive, like I'm hoping that he carries that on and one day be able to claim feminist. I don't know, we did our best. Does not have his first choice for a hairstyle, despite who he grew up with, right, is not my hair. Well, my hair today is a little better for him, but my hair in other states is not. So I think that's real. Like, that's a very long way of saying, well, I wish it weren't. I do think that if you are single and interested in a heterosexual relationship, it cannot be not on the table for you.
Absolutely, and it's popular culture. I mean, our earlier conversations about Beyonce and reality TV, et cetera, that there are so few examples in the public sphere of women who are sort of held up as, Black women who are held up as attractive, who are wearing natural hair. The conversations when Viola Davis showed up on the red carpet of I guess it was either the Golden Globes or the Oscars last year, and we have Wendy Williams and others sort of making that conversation. But I think part of this issue about attractability, I'm still holding on to that word.
It's a good word.
It works. It is about, thank you, is about the fact that there are so few limited options in terms of what both Black men and young Black girls can look at and is considered attractive, that there is this limitation when it comes to issues of what men would view as attractive, because that's all that the media is sort of framing Black women to be, to have not just straightened hair, but usually, weaves and things like that is the only way that Black women can be beautiful.
So I'm wondering, where does androgyny fit into this conversation, right? Because I think that we're seeing this again in the contemporary fashion moment that we're in right now, that androgyny is somehow, it's in, this idea of blurring the gender lines. And if we think about that as a way to kind of destabilize or at least challenge or push back against patriarchal constructions of hair and romance that link, that make it, frame it in a heterosexual conversation. And I see that even in the 1960s and 70s, there was this conversation about androgyny, that we could, if we think about ourselves as organizers, that can help to, destabilize these questions about the gender hierarchy, right, or this gender binary. So I'm wondering, how can we use that as a way to think about our contemporary, moment that we're in as it relates to hair politics and conversations about beauty, and conversations about queerness even? Like, how does this fit into the conversation?
Well, if I remember even the conversations around the Afro in the 1960s, one of the great critiques of it and one of the great anxieties about it was that it was a style that both men and women could wear. And so there was all this, a thing about, what does it mean to be an attractive woman, that you're wearing your hair like a man. The women who were of a previous generation, one of their major critiques wasn't so much because of, part of it was this idea of unstraightened hair, but part of that anxiety had to do with the fact that, in their opinion, women were looking like men, and that was a problem. So that tension was there even back in the 1960s, where we can think about this natural hair moment.
We are in this whole moment where I think androgyny for white people is sort of a thing. So on the catwalk, like when I say androgyny for white people, right? So there's this model who models as both a man and a woman, and people all flip out because we didn't know you were a woman when you were a man modeling, and we didn't know you were a man when you were a woman modeling. And the look is really, I don't know that that's so much true for black people. I'm not saying no black people anywhere, right? I'm just saying I'm not seeing a move and embrace of actual androgyny, not concerns about femininity, which is what I think the afro was about. Like, so how are you going to be feminine if your hair looks like a man's hair? Because that's how we define and do femininity. I don't know that that's a gender anxiety. I mean, if we wanted to like really start to disentangle those things. So I don't see androgyny so much in mainstream in popular culture. Like, I don't know where I would find it. I'm not saying I don't know any androgynous black people, but just sort of I don't see it as much.
So I love this, and in fact, it seems to me that part of the androgyny piece is also a standard, particularly among sort of in white popular culture, of extremely thin women. So part of the androgyny is that they end up looking like adolescent boys, right? And so that's kind of, so you end up with like the Anne Hathaway version of a sort of Hollywood androgyny that is reminiscent of kind of Breakfast at Tiffany's, that is, that preserves a sense of vulnerability because of the tininess of that person. And so there's this feminine vulnerability associated with a physical androgyny, but that's very different than the claim you're making about seeing oneself as a worker or as an organizer or as an identity that is not itself cross-cut against gender. So I think that is that's a challenging question. Let me ask the first. So I asked about the patriarchy within heteronormative. Let me then ask the question that actually both of you have moved to at one point, both Tiffany and Noliwe, which is the intergenerational question. So every time I see older black women who are viewers of the show, they're just the only people who are still honest with me in the world. So, it's very kind that I meet lots of people who say that they love the show, but you gotta know there are people walking past you also thinking, I hate your damn show, but they don't, they don't stop and say that to you, right? But what I love is older black women consistently tell me that I look much fatter on television, or they tell me, they'll ask me questions about, it's really, there is nothing better than a 60-plus black woman, because she will tell you the truth, right? Or at least convey to you a kind of a truth that is about a particular version of black womanhood. So if we've got a patriarchy piece, and particularly around heteronormativity and a particular form of romance, what then also about the question of black women's hair and our intergenerational?
Okay, let me say this. So I struggle regularly with the whole coloring my hair thing, right? And for all of the have not put a straightening comb or straightening products in my hair since, probably college. I'm all about running to the CVS and or the beauty parlor when there is gray showing through at a level that I can't stand. And I just like a few months ago, I was really like, because my husband is all like, go gray, you'll look great, age gracefully, I'm here for you, right? And I'm trying to, right? And I'm trying to like work with them and be like, okay, like that all that rhetoric is rhetoric that I absolutely embrace. And as much as people will tell you look fat, people are also like, she need to stop using that dark black on her hair, right? She's 70 years old, like you can. I have the hardest time finding images, just take hair in just a little bit different direction, about intergenerational, right? Finding black women who will let their hair go gray. The whole couple months ago, clearly, right? I got over the whole, like, let's embrace the gray. And in fact, now have highlights. So I went, not only got rid of the gray, added some caramel color, right? But I really was thinking about, like, how is this hair movement that we're in, this embracing natural hair is becoming a multi-million-dollar business, and is not taking sort of love of self and this natural, I want to put in quotes because you're still constructing a natural identity, right, is not at all, at least in Black communities that I'm aware of, that I can find. Because really, even Googling, Anthea comes up as the model for Black women with gray hair. I'm serious, if you start doing Googles of, Black women with gray hair, because I was like, okay, I need role models. Let me try to find some people. It was really Anthea. And as I talk to people, people are like, well, if I could look like Anthea, I would do it. But if you don't ever let your hair go gray, how are you ever going to look like Anthea, right? Like, it's a process. You have to actually see some gray to get there. But you get to a point and you're just like, no, I'm not trying to do that. So I don't know what that means. It just struck me about talking about intergenerational, like in moving from one generation to another and what that means. And as we talk about hair as a marker of that, what seems to sort of not be on the table.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think to go back to the moments in the 1950s and the 1960s where more African-American women, though certainly not all, as Tanisha points out, were beginning to embrace their hair in the non-straightened set, without the straightening comb. And the conversations that were happening with older Black women have to do with what did, or even does, we can think about, straightened hair represent. And for a group of women that had come of age in the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s, again, straightened hair was not about them being white, but to them it represented proper grooming. To them, it represented discipline. It represented that to have your hair not straightened was like to be a motherless child, right? And so, I remember this is not about straightening, but with my mom, who's probably watching, who said, but when we were children, we had a school principal who would talk about our mother parts, right? The ways in which my mom would get in and get that hair parted perfectly and, slicked back and shiny and greased up, and all that. That was a sign that you were a cared for child, right? That was a sign that someone loved you enough to sit you between their legs and snatch your hair, right? Like that was a sign that you were kept. And so for women of a particular generation, to go natural was to abandon this idea of Black bodies as proper, as disciplined, all the narratives, going against all the narratives that were being promoted about Black people, right? That we were unruly. Now, we can think about whether or not it is fair, and I certainly don't, that natural hair represents those things, but I do think it's important that we think historically about what those things represented and the cost of that, right? To be an unruly, unkempt, undisciplined Black person could often end you up in jail or hanging from a tree or a host of other things, so that there were real political consequences to being perceived as a particular kind of way. And so I think a lot of that tension, and we can think about how that same kind of politics of representation also exists today, right? But I do think it's important to at least appreciate just what a big deal that was for Black women to look at women that they thought whose hair was not being presented properly, how they felt that reflected on them as a race. And so I think that's where most of that intergenerational conflict was coming from.
Yeah, and to keep it right there in the 1950s, 60s era, again, I do a lot of work with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and a lot of these women that I've interviewed, they talk about this anxiety that some of the older women in the rural communities where they were helping to organize, they had over the hair. So I study how they make this transition from Sunday's best attire to denim overalls and jeans, and how they do this in part to align themselves with the Southern sharecroppers that they're working alongside. So they said that a lot of the senior women in the communities would say, okay, I can deal with the denim. I can get my mind around this. But baby, your hair, do you have to wear your hair in this kind of way? This short crop natural for a lot of these women. And so she said, Judy Richardson tells me, the hair became the cut line. That was what created the generational divide. It was about this hair, but the anxiety was not just about the women wearing their hair short and natural. It was also about the Black men starting to grow their hair out, right? So before we get to this freedom fro moment, right, still men they weren't wearing their hair closely shorn anymore, and what this was doing was disrupting the performance of a normative femininity or a normative masculinity in a way that was unsettling for a lot of people, even those with left-leaning politics a lot of times, right? And so we see, again, this politics related to a disruption of gender normativity that I think is an interesting tension that we see playing out today. And Darnell Moore has this great piece on the Feminist Wire where he talks about this, where he links his styling of his facial hair and the hair on his head with the fact that he may wear pink shoes and what this means in terms of how people are reading his masculinity. And in turn, what this means for Black women even who are choosing to push against these kind of normative constructions of femininity today. And so again, I see this historical link in terms of this gender divide over hair and anxiety as it relates to gender performance that was really critical to this 1960s moment when, again, part of this quest for full citizenship rights was tied into not only a performance of respectability, but the idea that doing that was linked to performing a normative gender, a normative sense of womanhood, a normative sense of manhood. And so what does it mean when young folks are disrupting this?
Unless we think that, we're enlightened 21st century folks who are not grappling with these kinds of questions, and even those who may identify as having natural hair, that, we're sort of beyond this performing of, of the need to be so well-groomed, et cetera. I think there's also, even within natural hair communities, tension over folks who just let a fro go loose, and folks who are sort of grooming in a particular kind of way.
Right.
Right. So that we're still sort of grappling, I think, as Black people and Black women, as in particular, with this idea of how to be perceived. Are we going to come out the house the way our hair looks in the morning? My hair doesn't have a chemical process. The color is henna. If anybody would like a recipe later on, but I still did not come out the house with way my hair looks when I first wake up in the morning. That I'm still engaged in a process of grooming and disciplining my hair. It may not be with a heating implement. It may not be with a chemical, but certainly I can assure you that I spend more time on my hair now that it's unchemically processed than I did when it was relaxed. So, and I think it has to do with these issues of grooming, and that even within natural communities that are, we're supposedly engaged in this kind of liberatory self-love of ourselves, we still are sort of performing respectability. We still are, many of us.
We need products.
Right. Well, yeah, and there's
It's
a whole
the
thing.
products.
We're definitely in the age of products.
Right, the product. I hope we talk about that.
Right.
The kind of product junkiism, the ways in which natural hair has sort of opened up this venue of where you need to find that right, perfect holy grail product.
From Kiki Curly to Miss Jessie's to you gotta have a whole.
You have to have all that, and now you can get them at Target and Walgreens, and all that, which is convenient, and it's a very celebratory moment. I think that these natural hair products. Actually, if you look at Black Enterprise this month, the cover of Black Enterprise is Lisa Price, the head of Carol's daughter, and the cover story is the business of natural hair. So it's becoming this lucrative business in this quest, I think, for even those who have natural hair to find that holy grail, to find that perfect product, to find that product that makes you look a particular kind of way, how different is that maybe? And I'm going to throw questions on you guys because I'm sure you all have lots to say about this. Is that much different than finding the right relaxer or the perfect straightening comb or whatever?
Well, Tiffany, actually, since you've started to engage the audience here, this we're at an hour. We've been doing this, and so what I want to do is in fact to open it up. Our house has gotten more and more full, and I also, unfortunately, I have to step out for 2 minutes. So what I'm going to do is take this as an opportunity to throw it out to the audience. If you can moderate for once, I just got a quick email thing here. So, and I will be right back.
Oh, good. Okay, so nobody has any questions? I just don't believe that.
They're moving.
All right, they're getting to their mics.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just thought people would go over to microphones. Well, you know what? Here.
Give her your mic. Come here. Good morning, everyone. Mike, I guess my comment is everything that you're saying, I taught for many, many years. And some of my memories of growing up, my brother would not start his breakfast until the hair ritual began, when my head was locked between my mother's knees. And it really saddens me as a teacher or a former teacher if you really want to destroy a young female child in a classroom, or even a young man for that fact, the first thing they do is they attack their hair. they really denigrate, and then it goes to the skin, and it's like you can't separate what's more important, the darker or lighter skin or the hair. So I guess my question is, how as a people do we, I see us moving forward, and I really think the Black Power movement that I grew up in opened up the door to this large array of hairstyles that we see here. But how do we stop parents and people within our own culture from making our natural hair or our hair period a negative stereotype? Because it is about aesthetics, and it is about the beauty, and the money that these girls spend is astronomical.
Do you want to collect some questions?
So-
Since there's kind of a lot of people.
Do you want to respond, or do you want me to
I
have
was
more
saying,
people?
because it's kind of a lot of people. You want to
Yeah.
collect a couple questions?
So yeah, why
and
don't we
then-
collect a few? So we'll have Chinyere here, and then the First Lady over
Otherwise,
here,
we
and then
just
I'll have them all
respond to,
respond.
like, 2 or 3 people.
I'm sorry, what? Oh, and I do need you to be brief, because there are quite a few of you who want to get engaged, and we're streaming.
Okay.
So-
So I have two-pronged question. So first of all,
One question.
oh,
Chinyere.
one question?
One
Okay, well
question.
then
There are a
I'll
lot
ask
of
the first
people.
part. So my question is about the social structure here. Like you guys have talked a lot about how women in the past weren't really interested in looking like white people. They were interested in, being respectable and looking respectable. But we're talking about this in a context without this racial hierarchy, right? We're not really talking about that. So I was hoping that you guys could elaborate on that. And also, where's the revolution in all of this? That's all. I know. You can ask the first.
Hi, I'm one of those generational people with a 96-year-old grandmother, 70-year-old mother, and aunts. And I let my daughter, they said, cut her hair off. Was I crazy? Because we have this long, crazy, wild hair that I love. And when I wear my hair out, they say, you look like you don't have a mother. And I need the right answer. I gave my daughter the answer, but I need the answer because in their minds, I'm an improper mother. So I need an answer.
You're taking multiple questions.
They're all
Yeah,
connected.
because there's so many people,
Yeah,
we're like,
got
let's
it.
let a few people
Yeah,
ask
that's right.
questions.
Those three connect though.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and respond. Wow, those are heavy and deep questions, and my training as a historian has not fully prepared me to answer those psychological ones. And I think part of it is that we're all sort of walking that out. But particularly the first two questions about how do we stop the vilification of black hair? How do we stop that from being an insult, the way in which people wear their hair? And the question about what hasn't perhaps been spoken of enough, which is the role of white supremacy in sort of creating a kind of hierarchy of hair and difference. And I think those two things are very much linked, that really the critiques and the vilification of black hair, even coming from among black people, is very much rooted in these ideas of racial difference, and not just ideas of hair being a marker of racial difference, but that this then sets up a hierarchy to particular social, political ends, right? That the idea that black people's hair in its natural state is unkempt, is unruly, et cetera, are all ideas that are rooted in white supremacy. So I guess the answer to the question, which is not really an answer, but sort of a framing of it, is that we have to sort of put hair in a conversation with these other tools of white supremacy, right? That we have to sort of empower young people to be able to both assert their own sense of beauty and dignity outside of the realm of, the oppression of race, and also that we as black people need to be involved in that project. Now, is that an easy process? Is that a simple one and I can give you a sort of easy answer for that? No. But I think the conversation we're having, connecting these ideas to, power of the state in terms of enslavement, in terms of segregation, in terms of disenfranchisement, all these things are linked to the ways in which black people are vilified in terms of our personal presentation. So again, not an answer, but just
I think too, like just to piggyback off, then I think it helps to join those issues. There are real economic consequences for some black people around the ways that they wear their hair. There are companies who will not hire you if you have your hair in braids, in dreadlocks, or natural hairstyles. And there are companies who will fire you if you did not come to work looking like that. And then get braids, or I think the last one I heard about was, well, the last one was the newscaster, right? The black woman who had the eloquent response, and, you know, they were like, thank you, bye, peace. But it was also at Six Flags, I think, a couple years ago, and I know that UPS has a grooming code that specifically mentions no dreadlocks, no, their own, say what? FedEx does as well. There's sheriff departments, there's deputy mayors who have been fired over the years. It's not an isolated thing that certain natural hairstyles, most often associated and worn by people of African descent, are not allowed in corporate America. And the few times that they've actually gone to court, that we have rulings, the court has consistently sided with these businesses saying that they have to protect earnings and profits, right? Like if they feel like these styles, very often, what they say is that this is going to scare the customers. If you are at the front desk, y'all are laughing, I'm really serious. If you're working at the front desk of the Marriott and you have braids and white people don't want to see you in braids, then you will frighten them and their profits will be, you know, lessened. It's true for airlines, it's schools. Black children all over the country have been sent home from school in the past 10 years or so for wearing certain hairstyles that are all natural hairstyles. So,
and let's be clear, this is happening in a lot of these charters that particularly are the kind of black male respectability charters, where they make the boys all cut their hair into short crop fades, right? So not just women, but a lot, particularly around men, and the notion that there's only one way to be a respectable black male body, and that does not include long hair.
So there are consequences, right? At Hampton, you can't be in their business school if you have dreadlocks or braids because they're like, that's not appropriate. Yeah. I mean, we could go on with it. So as we talk about just hair as a self-love, or let's just embrace, there are real consequences for some people for some of this, right? And so making choices about wearing your hair in a straight style, not just for male companionship, but also for employment, depending on where you might want to work. And it's not fair. You know, like we think that something else should be true, but right now it is true. And so hair is still complicated, and it's not just a matter of saying love yourself, love your hair. It's not just, right? Because you have to teach people, you have to teach kids how to navigate this. So to the woman who said what to say, to you know. All you can really say is it's complicated, right? I mean, you can't wave a wand. I can't give you a sentence that's going to make it okay, that will take the pain away, that will make hair not complicated. But if she's willing, if people are willing to handle that, right? If you understand what that means, how you're going to be read, how you're going to be understood, and you're willing to walk with that, right? Then it may make it better in the future. But it's not that it's necessarily easy, except in Brooklyn, except like there are just some very specific places where you really can, and it's just not that big a deal. Like in academia, no one is going to really tell you, I need you to straighten your hair right now. In most places.
Quite the opposite.
Right.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think I was the
Actually,
last
yeah.
perm-wearing black woman in the academy at a certain
Quite the
point.
opposite. Which is problematic in its own right. too.
Yeah, and I think that it is troubling when these things happen to adults. But for me, it really pains me when I see it happening to our children. And we've seen this very recently play out in the public sphere with figures like Gabby Douglas and Willow Smith. And of course, then who gets also attacked with that is the black mother, right? And it's re-pathologizing the black mother, this problematic black matriarchal figure. But I think, and these young women, these are public figures, but what happens when it's every day in our communities? For me, that is particularly troubling, especially because, like I opened my remarks with the stories of my mother, who has so many hairstyles, like this whole shave thing with the whoop. I got this from my mom, right? This is what she was rocking. I've been natural for 10 years now, and I watched my mom go through all these things with locks and all these different changes. And I can look at my own hair journey from a young girl, from the very first time I cut my hair, to wearing a short Toni Braxton in 8th grade, to, wearing a Beyonce weave in college, right? Like, this whole journey, and so much of that was critical in terms of me finding out who I was as a Black woman and learning how to navigate these streets that I had to walk every day in my life. And so part of me wants to say, no, the answer isn't to tell them not to do it, not to express themselves through their hair, because I think it's so important. But how do we create this safe space for our children where we can have these, conversations, tell these hair stories, if you will, through the various stylings of our hair, but still not have to face, undue policing of the bodies of 9 and 10-year-olds. It's sad. And I think that for me, this is, again, hair stands in for this broader conversation about, challenges that race, sexism, patriarchy, all these things still raise for us. So I can feel where you're living.
I love the point you're making. I'm raising an 11-year-old daughter, which is why I ran out for a second. But your point about how do we create the safe space, and I guess what I would say is it's not safe to be a little Black girl in America. It is not. It is quite clearly not safe. So not safe that Hadiya Pendleton, with her really lovely, beautiful little face and her gorgeous little hair and all, was shot and killed. And Quavante Wallace, who is 9 years old and nominated for an Academy Award, is called a C word, and then people quitting in order to defend the right to call her a C word, right? It is not a safe place to be, and our hair becomes part of it. I mean, certainly part of my family's decision to flee Princeton, New Jersey, and there were lots of reasons for it, but part of it was fleeing the horror of being in a space that is friendly and lovely and nice as everybody was. They were asserting all sorts of things over and against my little Black girl's body, and particularly over and against her hair. So we're like, okay, we're going to New Orleans, and the Blacks and the people, and we live in the 7th Ward, and people are asserting all kinds of things over and against the little Black girl's body and against her hair. And so there is, I guess part of it is not only is it complicated, but it's also, it is not safe, right? It is not safe.
You want to collect some more?
Yeah, let's take
Hi, this is for Dr. Tanisha Ford. Is that you? Yes. My name is Ms. Denise Willis, Philadelphia Branch NAACP. Mr. Jerome Mondesire, President. Do you have a telephone or email? Because when you said SNCC, I was curious.
Do I have a telephone or my own personal?
Yes, that I can share with the office.
Oh, yes, we can definitely talk afterwards.
Thank you.
You don't want to live stream?
No, why would you share that? Here's my cell number and live stream, right? Yes, ma'am.
Hello, my name is Doris Thomas. I'm very much interested in learning more about the business of hair and how I would like to know even the Korean businessmen and women, as well as Indians, they all know about the business side of the hair and how billions of dollars have been, our people are spending money. Let's go back to, economics, power. If you want to look at us as a collective group, how much money we spend every year on the hair products, on the weaves. So when you want to do a natural do, you can do that. But when you want to do the weave, you can throw that on too. Can we talk about the business side, the economic power that we have collectively as women? And then can we talk about how other cultures how they are basically, they're making so much money off of us, and we're not realizing that we need to, develop our own products and create our own business plans and develop our own institutions, so that way we do feel empowered and we have that self-love, so we don't expect someone else to love us more than ourselves.
So this one is big enough that I think maybe we pause right here. I promise I'm going to collect a couple more, but this is a big one. So let me pause here and allow some responses.
Yeah, Black hair is a tremendous business, multi-billion-dollar industry, and you're absolutely right that since really the 1950s, that money has not been generated. It's not being generated by African American owned companies.
Businesses, right.
And so it is a very bleak picture, particularly by the time we get to the 1960s and 1970s, that once L'Oreal and Alberto Culver and all these industries, these multinational corporations figure out that there's money in black hair, they begin mass producing relaxers and all of these products to make that money. But what I would say, a glimmer of hope in that, and I still think there's definitely challenges with that, particularly with the distribution side, that if you go into most African-American communities, that the stores that are quote-unquote beauty supply stores are owned predominantly by Korean immigrants. And that's not just a fluke. That is something that they have been able to sort of get into that market and sort of seal that market by producing materials only in Korean, et cetera, and sort of creating a kind of immigrant ethnic enclave for beauty supply stores, which many immigrant communities have done with other industries, but that's what's happening in African American industries. What the glimmer of hope is, I think, is among the natural hair community, that we have a lot of women who started just mixing products in their own kitchens, whether it was Kinky Curly, whether it's Carol's daughter, or not Free Prestige, or Camille Rose, or these other products, is that they created a market through the internet, right? That through social media, through blogs, through other kinds of things, where people got to know about their products, and thereby sort of going around the kind of middleman strategy that has kept African Americans from gaining money in the manufacturing side. So they went to sort of a direct sale model, which goes back to the early 20th century with Madam C.J. Walker and these folks. This is not new. That's how they essentially started, by going directly to where black women are, and in this case, it's the internet, creating their products, and now those products are now being mass produced, and so many of these women who started out in their kitchens are actually doing quite well. But again, my fear is that if history is any lesson to us, that, and it already is happening, that these multinationals are now looking at natural hair as a particular kind of market, and are now getting in with what I think are subpar products, but they're a lot cheaper. Right? A tub of Kinky Curly is almost $30 or $16. That's a lot of money, right? So there are ways in which they're coming in and sort of undercutting cost. And so I think while there's this glimmer of hope, we also need to be cautious of that. And that these market demands are being driven by consumers. And so if there's any kind of what do we do to sort of keep that money more in?
How do we change the mindset?
Support support these products, support these African American owned ones now that they're having a kind of mass appeal. Because of the internet, we can sort of bypass many of these companies that are not doing things that are supportive to our communities and support these businesses directly. That's one thing we as consumers can do. We can vote with our dollars.
Yeah, and I think for all I too take issues with a lot of things that were in good hair. But I think one of the things it did for a lot of black folks was that it exposed some of the business aspect of hair. So certain people, you could see what was happening maybe in your local community when you went to buy your hair for your braids or for your weaves or whatever. But to see what happens beyond your community in terms of where this money is really being made, where the hair is coming from, I think that film did put this issue on the radar for a lot of people in ways that we had never thought about it before. Now, what the next step from that became for most people who then viewed that movie, I mean, that's a question that we can ask. But I think there's a similar process that goes on in other parts of the world as well. So again, as I mentioned earlier, my work is transnational, so I do a lot of work in London. And I was actually headed to the George Padmore Institute one day to do some research, and I'm walking down the street, and I started noticing that there were all these black beauty salons, and then next to them were beauty supply stores. But it wasn't Koreans who were owning them. It were South Asian folks, right? Because of different patterns of colonialism and migration, it creates a different grouping of people who are now participating in this market, but it was the same thing. It was so striking that I just started turning around and snapping pictures at this whole strip, of this community where there was just all these salons and different hair supply stores and products. And so I think that there's a similar dynamic. It's not just in the United States, but even in other parts of, at least from my knowledge of the Western world, we see these similar dynamics happening where black women are utilizing these products, and they're buying them from from sellers who are not part of their community per se.
Right.
So again, this is another example of the global dynamic of black hair, and that it's marketable not just in the United States, but it really is a global structure in place that's making black hair profitable.
And even about the Indian.
So I'm sorry, I'm gonna pull some more. We got a lot of voices. I want to let other folks in. Yes.
Hey, so I identify as feminist and as, you know, pro-black and all of these things. I'm wondering what you all think collectively about how it's most responsible to try to navigate these conversations, because there have been a couple situations in which I found myself being, despite the fact that I'm male and despite the fact that, you know, I haven't had to deal with these problems myself for the most part, I've a couple times found myself in a room full of, you know, black women or a mixed group of people in which I'm the most liberal, do whatever you want to do with your hair person in the room. And I'm not trying to, and I don't want to be that derailer who marginalizes other people who have personal experiences with it, but at the same time, I feel like I don't want to be irresponsible and have somebody saying something in front of, you know, younger relatives of mine, my nieces or my little cousins or something, say something negative about natural hair and have me be in the room and not speak up and you know, speak in defense in some kind of way. How would you recommend that or we navigate that?
All right. So that one's on the table, particularly sort of the male ally question. Okay.
As a assistant professor in a predominantly white male discipline, I just wanted to first thank you for having these type of discussions in academia. But my question is, or comment, I would really like to hear your thoughts or your reaction to the comments that Gabby Gifford got in terms of her hair when I'm sorry,
Yep.
yes.
I know, it's easy to do. It's easy to do.
Very, very sorry. But yes, about her hair and the fact that a lot of those comments came from black women.
All right, so we've got the male ally question. We've got the Gabby Douglas question.
I just was wondering, because I came because it says politics of black hair, which is a workshop I do all the time. Culture is that our hair has a whole culture and a whole history, that a lot of the issues that we're talking about could be eliminated if people understood the culture. Sure. You know, I mean, that it's not about personal style, it's not about academic pursuits, it's about understanding and knowing our culture, that our hair and our hairstyles, et cetera, go back over 35,000 years. And I think that a lot of folks don't have that information, so therefore they fall victim to the colonization. And that when we talk about older women and the proper care, I'm thinking, or I'm wondering how much people think that that's related to the oppression, it's related to the colonization, it's related to the media, it's related to all the facts that we don't see images of our hair, that when we were in slavery, we didn't have a way to take care of our hair. So I'm wondering, you know, if you all up there, about culture, because I haven't heard that mentioned.
All right, so I'll take one more. So we've got the male ally question. We've got the Gabby Douglas, and particularly the attacks from other African American women. We have this question about sort of the length and depth and breadth of our culture and how that's associated with anti-colonialism and all of those historical questions. And then we'll take a final fourth.
My question is, what types of conversations are we having in our hair salons, and how do those conversations compare to the conversations of our mothers? And do we still have what you would call a neighborhood salon, considering who they serve? Are they really serving people of the neighborhood, and also considering that women will travel miles to go to their hair, almost like churches? Yep. They will pass hair salons to go to a certain hair salon. Yep.
Okay, great. So then we have the geography question. All right, anyone on any of those?
I'll start with the last one about the conversations that are happening in hair salons, which is really the focus of the work that I did in Beauty Shop Politics, where I looked at since the beginning of the 20th century, the ways in which African American women have used the physical space of the beauty shop to engage in political pursuits that are sort of beyond the issues of hair. So yes, there is this process of grooming that's happening there, but it is through the beauty shops where we see Black political leaders like Bernice Robinson and others who are using their spaces to engage in things like voter registration, et cetera. There's also a lot of informal conversation, which I know the work that Melissa has done in barbershops, you know, the kind of informal political conversations that happen there as well are important. One thing I do want to say is that I've done research and have found that there actually are vibrant kind of political conversations still happening in beauty shops, as well as political action. The work that's being done there now has a lot to do with what I think is sort of the civil rights issue for Black women, which is the issues around health and health care and health disparities. The fact that African American women, in terms of, you know, life expectancy and a host of diseases are really sort of are really stigmatized with that more than anyone else. And what I have found is that beauty shops are actually a wonderful site in which to engage questions about Black women's health. So we have projects in places like San Diego where beauty shops and are allying with health educators to do breast cancer awareness conversations. They're actually having mammograms and things like that happening right inside of